Welcome, thank you for coming. This is a Research and Development Network meeting, but it's a special one because we're going to do a few things. We're going to divide the meeting into three parts, basically. The first part is going to be a continued discussion with our distinguished scholar lecturer that we heard this morning, Mark Halsey, that I had a hard time getting here from that room because on the way he was stopped by so many people who wanted to say hi to him. But he's with us for the first half hour, and even a little longer if necessary. The second half hour, there's a few of you who have agreed to do a short little 5-minute summary of your research activities in your jurisdiction, in your agency. And so we'll do that. And then the last half hour of the meeting will be a sort of a proper research network meeting, and we can talk about some plans for the future for our network, and hopefully I can entice a few more of you to help us out in the network to do the work that needs to be done for research to influence practice in our field. So the first half hour, I've asked Melvin, him from the International Association for Correctional and Forensic Psychology. I'm part of that association as well. It sponsored the Distinguished Scholar Lecture this morning, and I've asked Melvin to sort of moderate that part of the meeting. So, Melvin, up to you so that I can finish my coffee and you can kind of take it over. You want the mic? How many people are on Zoom? Well, two's better than nothing. Maybe more will get on. But do we know who's on Zoom?
Do you want to record it?
Hi, Judy. Are you connected and can you hear us? She said no.
Yes, she can.
There she is.
Hi.
There she is. Okay. How are you, Judy?
Very well.
Recording
Very
in
well.
progress.
Wonderful. And somebody else?
Samsung SM something.
Oh, Samsung. Who's Samsung? It's well, we don't know. It's their phone. Okay, well, that's okay. Over to you, Melvin.
All right. Good morning still, everybody here. Good day to those joining in on Zoom, and it's always good to see Judy. So we're going to continue, as Frank said, our discussion with Mark, and I'm going to first tell you a little something else about Mark, because now you guys all know what a dynamic speaker, researcher, thinker he is. I thought I would share a couple of things that Mark actually enjoys doing outside of researching and changing the world. So Mark is an avid piano player. And so for those who are musically inclined, you can find Mark in the lobby. He plays the piano. If you've got somebody who plays percussions and somebody who plays, the flute, you got a thing going. Loves to take long walks on in the Australian bush. I don't know about that. That seems dangerous to me, but what do I know? Loves working on and restoring old vehicles, which is something that him and I have in common, which also means that your credit card bill must be astronomical, because that is a thing. And probably one of the more important things is being present with his partner, being with family and friends, and certainly being present is a little difficult, right? We have to work to make sure that we're present. But Mark, so thank you so much. So I'm going to invite you to come up and have a seat facing the audience, and that way the folks on Zoom can also see you. And we're just going to open it up. So I'm going to allow anyone in the audience, if you have questions to start, I'm going to come around, pass the mic to you so that folks can hear you. But let's start there, unless you want to have any opening comments.
Well, it can be dangerous in the bush. That's all I'll say.
All right. Anybody have any questions to start?
Sure. Come on, folks, again, so here's it's a very general question. You sort of made reference to how pleased you are that the language has changed in a sense in our field, and now we can actually talk about desistance where people didn't even know what it was, 5 years ago even. Can you kind of put your finger on why it's taken so long?
Yeah, I need to use this, yeah? Yes, okay. I think it comes down to the fact that, and I was just reading a really important paper not so long ago by Shad Maroon and Steve Farrell on, I forget the title of it, but it was pretty recent. I think it was even 2020. And in that, basically what they're saying is that desistance is a frustrating concept. It holds out a lot of promise, but in a practice realm, in a work realm, people like real things that they can measure, hold on to, quantify, etc. So I think there's something about the penchant or the preference for hard quantitative data in measuring change that has worked against desistance, I guess, from its outset, because the study of desistance and how people get out of repeat lifestyles, based around crime and offending, was predominantly qualitatively, based, and it's a hard thing to quantify people's struggles, and the motion of progress and setbacks, etc. I mean, I in that custodial that is an attempt to show the patterns of, in a sense, attempts at persistence, if you could call it that, and then setbacks. But even within each of those bars of being out and being, there's so much complexity and all of that. So I think that's part of it. I think it's the so the flip side of that is, I think, why it has started to gain some. There's two reasons I think gain some purchase. Is I think people have worked, and this actually is, I think, something that the scholarly community has had to really reassess. How, if you're going to do qualitative research, if you're going to do ethnography, if you're going to do phenomenology, if you're going to study the meanings that people have in their lives and what they bring to situations, we have to work harder, and have worked harder, I think, to at least show how those individual narratives, if I can put it like that, those individual lives, perspectives, actually matter and can add up to something. Even, and again, I mean, it sounds like I'm having some sort of love affair with Shad. I'm not, but I'm going to mention Shad again. He wrote an article a long time ago called N=1, Criminology and the Person, and fundamentally that was all about the way in which if you can learn a lot from the right kind of case study.
Right.
And the question is, do you do violence to the process of overgeneralizing? It's all generalization as opposed to getting that balance right between the particular and the general. And so I think that's been a good thing. And then, I think just thinking harder about, okay, if you actually have to operationalize this thing called persistence, what would that look like? Don't just leave people with the concept that's just hanging conceptually in the air. These are there are real things that matter in these contexts. And
whereas risk is easy to operate.
It is, because in a way you can say everything's risky.
Yeah.
It's risky sitting here. The ceiling could fall down. There's probably a slim chance of that, but there's a risk. So you can have risk everywhere. It's omnipresent. Whereas desistance is a patchier, more kind of sometimes more opaque. It's a slippery thing.
Yeah.
So I think there's been a ground shift in that dimension. In that dimension of it.
Questions?
Hi Mark, I'm Mitesh. I'm actually a physician by background, so I'm a bit of an alien here. But I just wanted to recognise what an exceptional presentation you did this morning. I thought it was really inspiring, but it was also coming down to practicalities of increasing our awareness to find different things and co-design solutions, which I thought was really powerful. As a doctor, I have to ask something a bit medical, I guess, in this context. One thing you touched on in your presentation was about desistance being part of a broader thing called well-being.
Yep.
And you mentioned it. I'd just like to hear a bit more. What's your perspective on how desistance is part of well-being? Or how does well-being actually foster desistance?
Well, excuse me. There is a large literature, as you probably know, on the social determinants of health. But there is also an emerging literature on the social determinants of justice outcomes as well. And funnily enough, they kind of map over each other. And so when I think about well-being, I mean, there is, I think, start again, the mental health component and sorting that out in one's assistance journey and who's locked up and why is writ large not just in they come to corrections with obviously issues, mental health issues. There are big issues to do with trauma, both intergenerational and other kinds of trauma to be dealt with as well. So there's kind of a basic kind of task there in terms of getting someone's mental well-being, and then there is the physical well-being intact as well. So long time ago, Gresham Sykes, you might not know of him, but wrote the very famous, still one of the longest ethnographies of a prison to stand today, in Trenton, New Jersey in the 50s, the Society of Captives. And he talked about imprisonment, the pains of imprisonment and deprivations. And one was deprivation of security. But I've always taken him to mean that's not just about deprivation of psychic security, although it is about that. It's also about the deprivation of physical security. You are no longer truly the master of whether someone may literally do violence to you or not. It's all a bit on a knife edge in a sense. So you can't have any sense of well-being, and you can't anticipate and plan anything remotely like a meaningful future in jail until you have those two bases covered, mental and physical well-being. And that involves, the physical side obviously involves, the important operations of correctional officers, the architecture of the place, the mix of static and dynamic security, obviously. But then there's the mental health aspect, which involves justice health experts and professionals and others. And so if you're not mentally and physically well, you're not equipped to go on a desistance journey, because a desistance journey is bloody hard most of the time. And you're going to have to confront a number of obstacles. And you're going to have a certain degree of resilience. And you can't have resilience if you're not mentally and at least mentally fit, if not physically kind of well as well. So I think your point goes to, we need to look holistically at the person, and that someone's wellness might not just relate to their involvement in their immediate environment within a custodial context. You can produce unwellness by cutting off all contact or punishing people in particular ways with any contact with the outside world, for instance, etc. And the way in which cutting people off from families, etc., on occasion, or taking away privileges can sort of send them into a spiral, etc. The deepest, darkest example of that is obviously in the United States in long-term supermax custody, like ADX Florence, Colorado or whatever, where people literally almost go, they lose their sense of colour, they lose their sense of taste, they lose their sense of sound because of the nature of the facilities, and then you've got to somehow restore that well-being, and then they turn to the rest of the population. Craig Haney is, he's one of my absolute heroes as well. He's done huge work in that regard in terms of the effects of confinement. But my take-home point is that, again, that well-being is not just about what goes on in the context of a physical prison. It's also about how people project and imagine what's going on beyond the gate. People in this room, you can talk to someone who's just come off a bad phone call in a prison, for instance, and all hell can break loose sometimes because they can't get the full story from the end of the phone. The phone call's up at a certain time, and then they project and imagine something that's not going on, on the outside, and it can cause all sorts of internal turmoil. And yeah, that is resolved most often, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it might be about, is my partner sleeping with someone else? Is it someone died and I might going to be able to go to that funeral, etc. These cause, individual kind of turmoil and mental strain and stress, which is probably amplified by the nature of the custodial environment per se. So health is a huge thing, and look, I don't know enough to know about then, what goes on with, dental and doctor's visits and all of that in that context, which is hugely important as well. And this comes to the gentleman's question to me in the audience, which is the first question was around, we know that people get some of the best healthcare in prison, and they get better healthcare in prison looked after than they do in the community. And that's absolutely tragic, but it's so, because there is in particular custodial jurisdictions, there is a good level of care as such. But that's different from putting someone onto a good journey towards assistance. That's just physically looking after someone in a sense. But they're not divorced. Yeah.
Mark, kind of continuing on that point, you followed a number of individuals for a long time. Can you talk about what they or how they described a positive, impactful environment, not only within custody, but when they came out into society, what, for those who are considered successes, what did they see as kind of, this environment was nurturing? So both inside and outside.
Yeah, I have to pay my respect and thanks to David Brown, who's sitting in the front row. He's the Chief Executive of Corrections in my state, and I think he was Deputy Chief at the time, or maybe even Chief. I can't remember how long he's been in the job, forgive me, David, but he's been a huge supporter of this sort of research. And this sort of research can't actually happen without the likes of people like Luke and David and others actually taking a risk, quite frankly, and letting someone like myself and others into prisons to do work and not be fearful of sometimes some things that tell a bad tale. And the things that tell a good tale, you should do more of. So I just want to express my thanks in that regard. So let me come to your question. Look, I'm going to answer this in a really anticlimactic way. It's going to be so boring. When I talk, my answer is it's the little things. If I talk to someone that was managing to stay out and manage, and it could be feeding, we all know that sometimes for someone to stay out for 2 months is a huge feat sometimes, let alone 6 months, a year, etc., 2 years. But if I put questions to those people around, why are you doing well, or what was so why are you doing well and what was the ignition for change are two slightly different things. But I can say that what was the ignition for change for a lot of people is that they received words of encouragement from certain people in prison. There were certain prison officers predominantly, maybe they're social workers, but prison officers that actually just took them kind of under their wing in a good way and gave them encouragement and said, you don't belong here, you can do better. And they're just little words of encouragement. And sometimes in an environment where that's uncommon, that really lodges in someone's consciousness, and just that sense of someone believing in someone, that mattered and that carried with them. And that goes to the issue of even, I can think of several examples off the top of my head where people were cast in custody by people, sometimes by officers, but also other inmates, as you'll never amount to it, you'll never make it, you're going to be coming back. And then there will be a serendipitous chance meeting on the street between a correctional officer, just in civvy clothes, and that person. And they'll be walking down the road with their partner and whatever, a little kid in a pram or a little kid, and say, they bump into each other. And the conversation will ensue, wow, you're out, yeah, it's great to see you doing well, and what was it? And, it's just this little meeting and exchange of, it was what you said to me back then. And this is my point about capturing success stories. These things happen all the time, I suspect, but those little moments, those little turning points, which Lord and Sampson talk about, those minor and major and other sort of key turning points in people's lives, often just go into the ether and aren't reported on. So it was the little things in people's lives quite often. Sometimes it was just getting an even break from a member of the police force who chose not to report things and give them a second chance, and maybe they were pulled over for driving disqualified when they shouldn't be, and that could have set off a whole lot of violations of parole back to prison, but they've chosen to give them an even break and not disqualify them from driving. For instance, they pulled them over. So an even break kind of scenario. So it was the little things basically. And the other thing, of course, the big things in the literature from Love and Sampson, the big things that keep people out of jail are meeting a partner, obviously, having a family. In the United States, it was things like joining the military and getting structure and routine, etc. I'm not saying that's not necessarily so for Australia, but certainly not on the same scale. And actually being able to somehow get involved with a new peer group that has a different set of, in a sense, values and values different things and reinforces your positive kind of change process. But it's often, I don't know of anybody whose assistance process is not zigzag.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of anybody it's a linear process. It's always precarious. Yeah.
Well, I think, and others in the room can kind of comment on this, you said it's going to be a boring answer, but it's actually pretty complex.
Yeah.
The little things, for those of us who run or work in a correctional environment, that's a major process, right? To get an officer to remind an officer to say, hey, some positive feedback would be, nice, encouraging, what have you. And that person's going, yeah, but I've got a checklist of things that I've got to get done, and I've got to get it done on a particular schedule in order for this environment to even function. It's a little thing with a great big impact, but I think it's kind of our charge to kind of say we've got to build in that time for those little things.
Can I say something? It's something just else on that I wanted to say, and I think it's a two-way street. Like just as inmates will say, or residents will say, correctional officers all label us, but they homogenise us. They put us, we're all inmates, we're all up and no good, etc., etc. But I've had conversations with inmate groups where I go, yeah, but you do the same thing to correctional officers. You homogenise their lives and you put them in a certain box as not being able to do good, as not being able to show empathy, compassion, help you, etc., and that they're all out just to screw you over. So there's got to be some middle ground and meeting of the minds there, otherwise nothing moves forward. And I think the quote, I can't remember who came up with the quote, but you end up just with this toxic hall of mirrors, where everybody is acting as if someone is someone else, right? And so I think part of this process and going in and co-designing and talking and having dialogue is about demystifying who the hell each other is and what we want from life. Whether it's in working life as an officer or a social worker or a psychologist in that context, or as an inmate on their first day or their 1000th day in custody. We don't do enough of that. We fall back into our stereotypical kind of roles, and that's where people stay, predominantly, with some exceptions.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I think the more I think about how we've implemented, especially in the US, the R&R principles, and you had mentioned sort of getting in trouble talking about the difference between, and I appreciate it coming from the University of Cincinnati. The R&R model is the quintessential piece. But I think we really missed the mark in training tools without the person. And I think we've deconnected, right? We've created this model of QA and fidelity that you read scripts to people, right? Your presentation, I agree with Mitesh, was amazing. But if you would have sat at the podium and read it, it would have been uniquely different, right?
Yeah,
and we created curriculum like the words are the thing. And I think I'm curious of your thoughts around we've created an entire system that tells our staff to be impartial at best, neutral at some level, and catching people failing at probably most levels. Right? We give them a set of rules, we ask them to watch the rules, watch the people. And then we hire people who want to help people change, some of them. And we create this really weird context where it's not okay to care about the person that's in front of you. And I think that's where I struggle, right? Is creating a system that allows for us to connect with people and as staff and not be compromised, and be okay with like being part of the change process.
Wow, there's so much in that. I mean, it just stands as a comment. I think there's a line almost. Like I agree with everything. I agree with everything you said there. And I think there is really something in there around your comment around people feeling. I mean, let's just take a step back. To borrow David Garland's phrase about, when he was talking about, death penalty in the United States and the history thereof, and he called it a peculiar institution. Prisons are peculiar institutions as well. They're fairly strange places in one sense. They're important places, and that's why it's important to know what goes on in them. But it goes to your point around what kind of care and what level of care is one allowed to show in those places. And I think that's a critically important question in a sense, because there is the safest way is to be robotic about it, right? But we know that actually doesn't get people where they need to go, in a sense, right? So I think it's finding new, in a sense, parameters and a new language to actually to say, how do we create an environment where, as I said before, maybe we can kind of just pull off a particular kind of mask in our role and just get down to tin tacks. And yes, I know that there are things that can go off at a certain moment, but you don't kind of do that with people are on the edge, right? You do it with the mean first of all, and then you go from there. But I take your point, and the last thing, I know 5 minutes, the last thing I'd say is, I just want to say something about R&R. I think there's no inherent problem with R&R. It's just that's not a basket that's going to solve all the problems. You put all your eggs in that basket. And as people in this room know better than myself, one of the great problems with R&R is the lack of resources to, in a sense, deliver the program in the entirety at all times to people who actually need it. And I think it's not R&R or desistance, it's the way in which desistance paradigm can actually strengthen some of the work that can go on in R&R, I think, as well. I think that's kind of and that also my personal critique of that and what I've heard and seen is that it's often group-based work and people don't want to do hard recounting of trauma, for instance, and a lot of that work in front of others. And it's very hard sometimes to do that in groups, and it needs to be individualised, but that's a resourcing question as well, in a sense. So sometimes that takes the sting out of its effectiveness, but that's a whole debate for another day, sort of thing. But I take your point around care, and I wrote an article with a colleague a while back on balancing care and control in custodial environments, and it's a damn hard thing. But it comes back to that question I opened with today around why are we here? What is our job? Is it to contain? To what extent are we confusing and conflating compliance with, meaningful rehabilitation or reintegration? They're not the same thing, compliance. And that goes the same on the staff side. Compliance with the rules and how you do things is absolutely critical, but it might not actually be producing the outcome that we want, in a sense. So we've got to sometimes change those rules for the better.
All right, effective, and they come back because they feel that the only institution that is caring for them is actually the prison. And for them, it's just having a job in prison. Don't take me wrong, I don't mind them, they work a lot. They help me in maintenance, so for me it's good. But for them, it's almost impossible to reintroduce them into society because all they want is to come back to prison.
Yep. Yeah. Well, there's another small issue to tackle in 2 minutes. Isn't it Martinson that came up with the concept of learned helplessness in a sense? And there's that. So there's that as a concept. I understand something about that. But so there's a line that I've used before, and it goes like this: if people don't get good at living in the community by living in jail, and so if we had those kinds of efforts, as you just mentioned, kind of gathered around people that you're talking about in jail that help them to be someone. In other words, there's someone in jail and they feel like they've got their niche, and they feel relatively comfortable and competent, both in their own eyes and maybe in the eyes of others in that institution. The trick, or the challenge, is how do you actually replicate that in the context of the community, which has all sorts of other variables you can't control. At least in a prison context, you can control a number of variables: where that person's going to be, who they're going to be surrounded by, and to a certain extent some influence in the exact quantum of resources they get. In the community, it's a different thing and a different ballgame. So it's not necessarily. So the challenge is how do you empower that person in that community context with the right kind of I can only think of in the power of, and I'm a huge believer in the power of mentoring, and at a certain point having some degree of meaningful 24/7 round the clock help. I know that's resourceful and intense, but sometimes it's needed to get people started, and then slowly, you don't have a hard break, but you have a kind of a soft kind of break from that person and let that person eventually stand on their own 2 feet. There are very good mentoring programs that do that. They're often hanging on by the smell of an oily rag, but they can't be undervalued. That kind of mentoring kind of avenue. To me, again, it speaks to the importance of that reach in, reach out process, getting people from outside of jail to come in and start the journey of walking beyond the gate before you actually walk beyond the gate. It's tricky, it takes time, it probably annoys the hell out of some prison administrators, etc. I kind of get it. But it's pretty important for setting up good pathways, and that way because what that person's doing, just to end on this actually is a really good illustration of the difference, I think, between re-entry and reintegration. To me, re-entry is a moment in time. Re-entry is the point of stepping beyond the gate. It's a temporal thing. Whereas reintegration is a processual kind of thing and takes time, and that needs more support. So it's different re-entering society than reintegrating or integrating into society. So my money is on the idea that your person you just described needs help with reintegration, not just re-entry, and they might be able to kind of ensconce themselves in the community a little bit better. I mean, I know it's pretty hypothetical, but that's the best I can do sitting here.
As a psychologist, the part of my brain that's going, wow, look how this mirrors the developmental process, right? We have to nurture folks, we have to help them, we have to help contain them so that they can then, at some point, be independent enough to do these things on their own, right? For administrators, for folks, who control the purse strings, that's a very difficult concept because it requires a lot of time to do that. So, thank you, Mark. Really appreciate your time.
No problem.
We can take a little clap and I'll turn it back over.
And where am I now on this recording?
Right there.
Where? Over there, okay. And where should I stand?
That's fine.
I'm standing in front of Mark, for God's sake. Okay. I thank you so much, Mark, but I didn't want you to leave yet because I as he was speaking, we could go on, I think, for several more hours, no problem. And as Mark was speaking, I decided, as the chair of the Research and Development Network of ICPA, that we're going to have a virtual series of discussions with Mark and with others, not just you, but
It's gone completely insane.
yeah, with Mark and with some other academics in the audience here that, like Brian, like Danielle, like Rosemary, like others that are here, because I think it's an important conversation. I really do. I think it's an important conversation that we need to have. And I see actually an opportunity right now for researchers to rise to the occasion, because I see a sort of, and there's one thing I disagree with you on, Mark, is to say that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the R&R paradigm. I think there is. And
I'm scared to say.
yeah, of course, but I think there is. I think there is something fundamentally wrong with the R&R paradigm because it's dictatorial. it assumes that we're the experts and we can tell people what their problems are, what their risk factors are. I don't like that. I don't think it allows for us to move forward in terms of really transforming what corrections is about. And I think that as researchers, the time has come for us to speak more boldly, more loudly about what needs to happen to really fundamentally change the way that we run prisons and the way that we do community corrections. Yes?
Yes, I don't want to interrupt your forum. I'll ask for Melvin's. Melvin and I go way back. So listening to this, so I'm a physician. I've been in corrections for about 12 years. And I have to get a microphone. So I just before this, I said, Melvin, this isn't appropriate, but maybe you can set up a meeting for me with Mark, but then I just decided to talk anyway. So one thing is in the US, we don't use the word assistance much. So I had
I know you don't.
Right, I had to learn that. But what I wanted to say is there is an intersection between business, academia, and government that hasn't been fully exploited. So I work in a small consulting company, and I work with both the School of Business at Cornell University, my alma mater, and a new nonprofit called Social Purpose Corrections. And the reason I mention it is the debate we have a lot back in the States is, are private correction companies evil, for profit particularly? Are governments competent at this mission? And it occurs to me that the US is a pretty good environment to explore that because we just have so many people in jails and prisons. So I'll end it there, but just note that there are some aggressive nonprofits out there, at least in the US, that are trying to change the whole paradigm.
Right.
But we don't have the academic backing necessarily to put all that into practice. What we do say is we want to measure outcomes. You know, as a physician, we talk about this all the time, but I don't know that anyone has established what are the best corrections outcomes. It's a very blunt instrument. Do you go back in prison or not? Do you commit a crime or not? And there's got to be more to it than that. And that's all. I wanted to get on the radar and say that there's a lot of work we can be doing, and I think private nonprofit businesses are probably a good playground for that. Thanks.
I mean, you're absolutely right, they are. And little things happen. I'll tell these guys a little thing that happened on our walk back to this room. Mark was invited to do a plenary session at the next American Correctional Association conference in January, and then to do a bit of a roundtable with some correctional leaders. So it's a little thing, but I told Mark it's a big thing.
It really is.
It's a big invite to America, and so really I'm going to repeat myself. I think this is a time for, as researchers, as scholars, to really come forward and help the field move quickly into a different era, if we want to call it that, a different era, where there isn't any moral injury anymore going on, right, Rosemary? And where there's relational, an emphasis on relational capital, as Kevin likes to say. We need that transformation. Anyways, Mark, you're going to hang around? Yes?
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Please hang around. But we did promise to give some people an opportunity to just do a 5-minute summary of some of the research, some of the work that they're doing for the benefit of the rest of us. But we're going to videotape that little 5-minute summary. And Kevin, you agreed to do that, right? Is one. Danielle is another. Yvonne is another from Hong Kong. And Selena?
Income. We're doing for Singapore income.
Okay, from Singapore. So we're going to start with Kevin. Is that okay with you?